Sirens screamed from phones and walls as the market feed bled red across the glass. Victoria Hale said, "Hold your positions." Her voice cut through the static, but her hand trembled around a cold paper cup. Mason Reed said, "It's a coordinated hit or a breach." Ava Pierce said, "Hashtags are trending. Sponsors are freezing buys." Daniel Price said, "We lock down comms and hold the board in 30. The building seemed to tilt as headlines stacked like falling bricks. Victoria said, "No panic, only motion." Traders stared through the glass like witnesses to a wreck. Talia Brooks said, "Unusual short spiked 5 minutes before the leak." The elevator chimed and no one moved. Victoria said, "Pull logs, isolate servers, silence rumors." A storm rolled over the skyline as if the city inhaled. Daniel said, "We need a face, not a firewall." Victoria said, "My face then, and no one blinks." The press room smelled like ozone and fear as microphones blinked awake. Victoria said, "We are investigating an unauthorized disclosure and market manipulation." Cameras clicked like teeth while patients bled out of the room. Mason said, "We've contacted regulators and trading venues." A reporter shouted about offshore entities and missing disclosures. Ava said, "We will take 2 questions, then issue a full statement online." Victoria said, "We will not be bullied by rumor." The crowd surged as if smelling a spill. Daniel said, "Fact first, narrative later." Victoria's throat tightened, but her stare never wavered. Another headline marched across a screen like a verdict. Victoria said, "We built this company to endure shock, and it will." Back upstairs the boardroom felt smaller, as if the walls learned to lean. Daniel said, "Trading halts if volatility bands fail." Mason said, "Cash is fine this quarter, but covenants will sniff panic." Victoria said, "We buy time, not illusions." Talia said, "Patterns suggest someone seeded the rumor ahead of an options wall." The table vibrated as another alert rolled in like thunder under the skin. Ava said, "Influencers are stitching your old interview with the leak." Victoria said, "Then we stitch truth faster." Daniel said, "We need a scapegoat or a shield." Victoria said, "We need evidence, not sacrifices." The clock hands hacked forward and took the room with them. The mentor's voice arrived like gravel over a wire. Arthur Quinn said, "You don't fight a firestorm with pride." Victoria said, "I won't yield the narrative to ghosts." Arthur said, "Your moat was trust, now it is ash." Wind rattled the window as if the city disapproved. Victoria said, "I have a plan, and it starts with clarity." Arthur said, "Clarity costs more than you think." She traced a circle on the glass where rain had thinned to scars. Ava messaged that regulators were on the line. Victoria said, "Patch them in and record everything." Arthur said, "Remember who profits from panic." The call ended, leaving a bruise of silence where advice had been. The trading halt hit like a trap, snapping on bone. Daniel said, "Limit down, then full stop." The floor groaned with the weight of swallowed decisions. Victoria said, "We pivot to internal forensics and a measured disclosure." Mason said, "Vendors are pulling credit lines in whispers." Ava said a file just surfaced claiming mispriced assets. Talia said, "It cites spreadsheets only we host." Victoria said, "So the leak is not outside, it is inside our house." Air thinned as the word inside seemed to dim the lights. Daniel said, "Who benefits if you fall today?" Victoria said, "Everyone who never dared to build." She drew a breath that tasted like rust and resolve. Dawn burned off the storm, but the heat moved indoors as the audit line crackled alive. Victoria said, "We will cooperate, disclose and preserve evidence without delay." A voice from the regulator asked about valuation models that now read like wishful math. Daniel said, "The models are conservative, the panic is not." Another voice asked who had super-user rights on the data lake at the time of the leak. Talia typed hard and drew a box around a ghost credential that should not exist. Mason said, We will rotate keys and restrict access to a hardened subset. Ava said, we will publish a timeline and update every hour on verified facts. The board chair demanded calm while the line kept swallowing seconds like a broken metronome. Victoria said, we accept oversight, but we reject the funeral you are writing for us. Silence answered like a shrug, and the meeting ended with a sterile promise to reconvene. Outside, the city brightened as if it wished to witness the next mistake. The war room glittered with cold dashboards as the building exhaled tired rain. Talia said, this credential logged in from 2 cities within 10 minutes. Daniel said, spoofing or a tunnel. Victoria said, keep digging, map every call, and mirror the data to a vault. The security tech traced a path that kinked through a vendor-shared account. Mason said, we cut that vendor today and go manual where it hurts. Ava said, media wants a villain, and this breadcrumb feels almost too neat. Talia said, the log signature matches an old migration script we retired. Daniel said, someone resurrected it to walk out the front door. Victoria said, then we lock the doors and set a tripwire for the next step. The hum deepened as monitors painted everyone in evidence-colored light. The floor's quiet made the betrayal feel closer than air. The board met under portraits that judged without blinking. Eleanor Shaw said, markets punish opacity harder than fraud. Victoria said, you will get every bite and every breath I owe this company. Daniel said, a leadership vacuum will turn a crisis into a collapse. A lawyer asked whether executives traded in the window before the leak. Mason said, I cancelled my orders and documented them. Ava said, if you replace her now, the headline writes itself in blood. Eleanor said, then give me a clock and milestones, or I move for suspension. Victoria said, 24 hours forensics, 60 for remediation, daily reports. The room weighed her offer while the portraits leaned forward like a jury. Eleanor said, clock starts now. Miss it, and I count votes. Victoria nodded once, and the seconds began to cost more than cash. The hit piece landed at noon with a headline that bit like ice. A clip rolled of Julian Cross praising transparency while smirking at the camera. Ava said, he bought the primetime slot and timed this for maximum bleed. Victoria said, let him preen, we will speak in ledgers and logs. Sponsors paused campaigns like birds freezing in a sudden shadow. Daniel said, our covenants will repress if the halt extends. The article leaned on anonymous insiders who spoke with surgical malice. Mason said, we counter with an audit letter and an interview tonight. Victoria said, I will not beg, I will testify. Ava said, then we film in your office, no makeup, no choreography, just truth. The team nodded while the windows reflected a city rehearsing outrage. Evening collapsed into cables and coffee while thunder retreated to memory. Talia said, tripwires armed. Any exfil will tag a canary file with a slow poison. Daniel said, we also need a human firewall, and that means fewer mouths. Ava said, I cut the list to 8 and locked their devices in quarantine. Mason said, we leak our own memo to flush the rat from cover. Victoria said, no games that risk the company, we trap without theater. Talia said, Ghost credential just pinged a sandbox, it thinks it found gold. Daniel said, then we wait, record, and end this with a name. Victoria said, at dawn I face the world, tonight we face ourselves. The room steadied as the building decided not to fall for one more hour. Outside, the river moved like a long verdict no one could outrun. Dawn found the office smelling of hot metal and sleep. Talia said, the canary sang twice and routed through finance. Mason said, finance touches every system. That proves nothing. Daniel said, it proves opportunity, not intent. Victoria said, we separate duties and review every approval. Ava said, media is circling a whistleblower who claims mispricing. Marcus said, someone swapped model parameters after midnight. Victoria said, show me the audit trail and the hands that moved it. A hush crawled over the floor like frost under a door. Eleanor called and said, "Your 24-hour clock bleeds." Victoria said, "Then we bleed forward and name a culprit." The elevators chimed like a countdown. No one could stop. Talia said, "The ghost credential cloned Mason's permissions." Mason said, "Or someone framed me while I slept." Victoria said, "No one is immune, not even me." Lights hardened the office into a studio while the city rehearsed outrage. Ava said, "We go live in 60. Keep answers crisp and human." Daniel said, "Facts first, then empathy." A producer counted down like a fuse. Victoria said, "I will not barter truth for theater." Julian's clip rolled again, smirking through the feed like a dare. Mason said, "He is baiting you into anger." Victoria said, "He will get math, not fury." The chat crawled with knives and prayers. Ava said, "Lead with the timeline and the vault." Victoria said, "Then ask who profits from this panic." The red light blinked awake, and the room felt as small as a throat. Somewhere below, sirens braided with applause no one earned. The signal trail dipped into the garage where air smelled of rubber and secrets. Talia said, "Beacon puts the canary near locker C17. Marcus said, "Keypad shows fresh prints." A motorbike echoed like a heartbeat. Victoria said, "Open it and record." The door popped to a drive and a note that read Basilisk. Daniel said, "A hunter's name, or a warning." Footsteps ghosted above them like doubts. Talia said, "Security cam caught a cufflink with our crest." Marcus said, "That narrows the choir to the front pew." Victoria said, "Pull badge data and cross with last night's logs." The bike screamed away, leaving a ribbon of fumes and a question that would not share its name. The board convened like a storm that had learned to speak. Eleanor said, "Independent oversight will hold veto on operations." Daniel said, "Veto is a blade that cuts stamina." Mason said, "If it preserves the company, I support it." Ava said, "The headline becomes surrender, not stewardship." Victoria said, "We accept an observer, not a warden." Lawyers rustled papers like dry leaves. Eleanor said, "Votes exist to replace you by morning if milestones fail." Victoria said, "Then give me room to meet them." Silence pressed until glass seemed to bow. Daniel said, "Compromise saves blood." Victoria said, "Compromise also feeds sharks." The motion hung, heavy as a sentence not yet spoken. Night fell like a lid as the canary chirped a third time, and changed its tune. Talia said, "Exfil just pivoted to the board lounge subnet." Daniel said, "Who is upstairs after hours?" Ava said, "Cameras show a coat and a briefcase, face obscured." Victoria said, "Lock doors and walk me in." The lounge smelled of lemon oil and threat. Mason emerged from the corridor holding nothing but fatigue. He said, "I came for covenants and coffee." Talia said, "The ghost credential switched hosts mid-hop." Betrayal. Daniel said, "That is choreography, not luck." Victoria said, "Then someone is dancing us toward a cliff." Her phone buzzed with a shell company name tied to a rival fund. The room listened to the hum and heard intent. Morning rose like a verdict no one could appeal. Marcus said, "I traced Basilisk to a sandbox hidden under finance." Talia said, "The script mimics legacy backups and harvests tokens." Mason said, "Anyone with my template could spoof me." Daniel said, "Chain of custody matters more than outrage." Arthur called and said, "Your moat is trust rebuilt in public, not whispers." Victoria said, "Then we show the autopsy while the heart still beats." Ava said, "We stage a live walkthrough and publish the logs." Eleanor texted a countdown that read like a blade. Arthur said, "Elevate the one who found the door and lock the rest outside." Marcus said, "Give me keys and I will trap the operator." Victoria said, "You have them and the room." The team felt the floor tilt from fear to purpose. The war room thrummed, as if the building had a pulse. Marcus said, "I seeded a decoy ledger with a hidden lattice." Talia said, any copy triggers a beacon and hashes the path. Mason said, we expose our map if this leaks. Daniel said, we expose truth. That is the price. Ava said, narrate each step for the camera and cut nothing. Victoria said, show the world the lock and the thief's hand. The decoy flickered, and a route lit up like fuse wire. Marcus said, jump to vendor's subnet, then board lounge, then a private relay. Talia said, the relay belongs to a fund tied to Julian. Victoria said, document, then call legal. Fear thinned as a plan found breath. Arthur arrived in person with a face carved by old storms. Arthur said, your rival sells certainty packaged as charm. Victoria said, charm fades when math speaks. Arthur said, math needs a storyteller who bleeds and stands. He set a folder down like a stone. Arthur said, here are board debts and favors that bend votes. Daniel said, this complicates governance disclosures. Ava said, we cannot weaponize shadows and claim virtue. Arthur said, name the rot or it eats the rafters. Victoria said, we will disclose ties and publish waivers. Mason said, some sponsors will bolt. Victoria said, let those who fear light leave. The mentor watched, then nodded, as if the torch had finally been lifted. The board reconvened with air thin as high altitude. Eleanor said, you propose elevating an engineer over officers. Victoria said, I propose elevating results over titles. Marcus said, I can identify the relay operator within hours. Daniel said, he gets limited authority and a claw. Mason said, if he fails, I will accept blame for the attempt. Ava said, we live stream the process to kill rumors. Eleanor said, if you stumble, I move the vote. Victoria said, then watch closely and count fair. The motion crawled, then passed with a reluctant spine. Marcus said, tripwires armed, bait loaded, and the lattice sings. The room exhaled like metal cooling after a forge. Evening framed the office in copper and glass. Marcus said, contact made. Our decoy ledger is sipping through a private relay. Talia said, the fingerprint matches the basilisk toolkit. Daniel said, preserve packets and time-stamp every hop. Ava said, the audience needs clarity, not spectacle. Mason said, the relay terminates in a suite leased to a shell. Victoria said, name the shell and the owner. Marcus said, the shell ties to a donor in Eleanor's network. Silence hit like a dropped plate. Eleanor said, disclose and proceed, or slander ends your tenure. Victoria said, we proceed and disclose. The capture completed and wrote a map that looked like intent. Marcus said, Basilisk drafted a board resolution before the leak. The lattice sang again and mapped a signature like a bruise. Marcus said, Halberd Holdings fronts the relay. Talia said, Halberd resolves to a trust in Delaware. Daniel said, a trust can mask an army. Eva said, Halberd donated to a committee tied to Eleanor. Victoria said, we disclose now and preserve every byte. Mason said, we should negotiate before we torch bridges. Marcus said, the relay key fingerprints match Basilisk. Daniel said, chain the evidence and call counsel. Ava said, we draft a plain English brief and a technical annex. Victoria said, name the owner behind Halberd. Marcus said, it circles to Gideon Black and a fund aligned with Julian. The room tilted as if the city leaned in to hear the next word. The board lounge felt colder than the glass. Eleanor said, you implied my network orchestrated theft. Victoria said, I implied the money trail bends toward power. Daniel said, we have to disclose ties and timing. Eleanor said, disclose and you crater sponsorships. Ava said, silence is worse than loss. Mason said, there is room to settle with the fund. Marcus said, the fund sits behind the relay that bled us. Victoria said, I will not trade truth for quiet. Eleanor said, then brace for a vote and a storm. The portraits watched like old creditors. Victoria said, "The company breathes only if the air is clean." Gideon appeared on a wall of glass like a storm given a voice. "Well," Gideon Black said, "I can recapitalize and soothe creditors." Victoria said, "At what price?" Gideon Black said, "Your resignation, a proxy CEO, and veto on asset sales." Daniel said, "Those terms gut governance." Ava said, "He wants the headline that erases us." Mason said, "If this steadies the ship, we should weigh it." Marcus said, "Basilisk spoke to his relay before the leak." Gideon Black said, "Prove it in court while I buy your debt tonight." Victoria said, "We will prove it to the world now." The call ended like a lid slamming on a fire. The trap sprung at dusk with a quiet click. Talia said, "Basilisk just cloned the decoy ledger." Marcus said, "Route terminates near Mason's office safe." Mason said, "Then someone planted hardware in my walls." Daniel said, "We search with counsel present." Ava said, "Cameras stay rolling for the record." The panel slipped free and showed a relay tucked like a tick. Marcus said, "Serial ties to Halberd's vendor." Mason said, "I did not do this." Victoria said, "We treat facts, not fear." Daniel said, "Seal the room and log the seizure." The building hummed like a jury learning its lines. Night brought cameras and a choice that felt like glass. Victoria said, "We disclose donors' ties and the relay found on-site." Ava said, "We release logs, serials, and the capture timeline." Daniel said, "We notify regulators before the broadcast." Marcus said, "Basilisks compile hash matches our vault sample." Mason said, "I will stand on camera and deny collusion." Eleanor said, "If this fails, the vote proceeds at dawn." Victoria said, "Let the vote measure truth, not theater." The red light blinked alive as the city held its breath. Somewhere, Gideon dialed lenders and smiled at the rate. The interview began, and the floor felt finally level. Dawn scraped the skyline, while the building held its breath for the vote. Victoria said, "We win with facts and the courage to show them." Daniel said, "Facts cut both ways. Make peace with the wound." Ava said, "Cameras at 9, regulators at 10, board at noon." Marcus said, "The lattice logged a midnight probe from a quarantined device." Talia said, "The probe compiled a payload that only a superuser could sign." Mason said, "Then find the superuser and stop circling my floor." Victoria said, "We follow signatures, not suspicions." The city outside looked polished and dangerous, like a blade in a suit. Daniel said, "Gideon will press the debt clock to force hands." Ava said, "Then we narrate the debt before he weaponizes it." Marcus said, "I can trigger the decoy and force the operator to blink." Victoria said, "Do it on the record and with counsel." The lights brightened as if the building wanted history on film. By 9, the press room vibrated like a hive learning a new queen. Victoria said, "We were targeted by a relay funded through shells and favors." A reporter asked who signed the doors the thief used. Ava said, "We will show the serials and the path of entry." Daniel said, pending enforcement, "Everything is preserved and escrowed." Julian appeared on a split screen and smiled like a locksmith. Mason said, "We cannot litigate with microphones." Victoria said, "We can inoculate with light." Gideon called in and said, "Debt is a clock, and I own the hands." Victoria said, "Clocks are honest, thieves are not." The room shifted as if gravity moved toward the evidence table. Ava said, "At noon, we submit the annex and the sworn statement." Victoria said, "Then we meet our judges." The cameras fed the city a taste of the fight to come. Noon arrived with the hush of a verdict stepping into shoes. Eleanor said, "Present and be brief." Marcus said, "We seeded a decoy ledger signed by our secure module." Talia said, "Any copy triggers a beacon that records root and sinner." Daniel said, "Council observes chain and timestamps." Victoria said, "Begin." The decoy pulsed, and the beacon stitched a path like thread through bone. Marcus said, board lounge subnet, vendor relay, and a device assigned to Mason's safe. Mason said, I was framed, and you know I was quarantined. Talia said, this purchase order shows the relay billed to your cost center. Daniel said, and this audio shows your voice authorizing access at midnight. Mason said, that is a splice. Victoria said, it is a confession. The room inhaled like a struck match seeking oxygen. The floor quivered under the weight of what names can do. Mason said, I protected the company from your hubris and sold time we needed. Victoria said, you sold truth for leverage and nearly sold the company. Gideon said, accept the proxy and save the carcass. Julian said, markets forgive leadership that knows when to yield. Daniel said, the market forgives disclosure, not collusion. Ava said, public stream is live, and thousands are watching. Eleanor said, motion for removal stands, but evidence compels a different remedy. Victoria said, I tender operational control to an interim while I remain accountable. Marcus said, I will serve with scope limited to forensics and controls. Eleanor said, motion amended to appoint Marcus and suspend Mason. The vote clicked like a lock finally choosing a door. Security walked Mason out past portraits that suddenly looked away. He said, you will thank me when debt eats you alive. Victoria said, we will thank the ledger that saved us from you. Gideon said, my offer expires with your vanity. Eleanor said, our disclosures post in 1 hour, and your influence ends here. Julian said, the audience wanted blood. You gave them paperwork. Ava said, paperwork is where blood is counted. Daniel said, regulators acknowledged receipt and scheduled interviews. Marcus said, controls are live, and Basilisk is pinned to the wall. Victoria said, the empire stands, but the crown is heavier than lead. The board dispersed like a tide, leaving stones to dry. The building finally exhaled and learned to stand again. Morning opened like a ledger turning to its last page as the building shivered toward normal. Victoria said, we kept the company, but the stain will not scrub out soon. Daniel said, stains teach governance better than slogans ever can. Ava said, the statement trends clean, yet the comment tide bites. Marcus said, controls are live, and the lattice sleeps with one eye open. Talia said, regulators booked interviews and requested the compile chain. Eleanor said, the market will reopen, but you and I must settle succession. Victoria watched the skyline harden and said, the crown is heavier than the roof. Daniel said, you can remain and be ground into filings. Ava said, or step sideways, and the mission survives you. Marcus said, you fought the fire, but rebuilding needs different hands. Victoria said, then I will carry the blame and hand off the keys. The room absorbed the choice the way old wood drinks rain and swells to fit its nails. The board met under a ceiling that remembered every oath and every lie. Eleanor said, we convene to discuss leadership and the path forward. Victoria said, I will resign as CEO at close and remain to complete disclosures. Daniel said, an independent caretaker assumes operations with Marcus over controls. Ava said, we publish donations, waivers, and the Basilisk Annex in full. Marcus said, the lattice and vault stay under dual custody and camera. Talia said, all compiles are notarized and mirrored to escrow. Eleanor said, this is a steep price for a narrow bridge. Victoria said, it is the only bridge that holds. A message blinked that Gideon filed suit to block the plan. Daniel said, we can beat speed with sunlight. Eleanor said, motion to accept the resignation and appoint interim leadership. The vote ticked and then landed like a gavel on a quiet heart. The market bell returned like a heartbeat patched with wire and will. Ava said, we are live, and volume is thin but honest. Marcus said, autoblocks are catching anomalies before they breathe. Daniel said, credit lines thaw when storms confess their names. Eleanor said, Sponsors call back once a spine appears on paper. Arthur arrived and said, "You chose the wound that heals straight." Victoria said, "I chose the cost I should have counted sooner." Arthur said, "Ambition is a mortgage with a floating rate." Talia said, "Regulators confirmed the annex and scheduled sworn testimony." News crawled that Gideon's suit faltered under disclosure glare. Ava said, Julian's feed turned from smirk to silence. Victoria said, "Silence is a receipt, not a cure." The floor seemed to rise to meet their shoes, and the building remembered how to stand without swaying. Her office became a museum the instant the box touched the desk. Ava said, "I can stall the handoff if you wish." Victoria said, "A promise delayed becomes a story that rots." Daniel said, "Your letter reads like steel and mercy." Marcus said, "The controls will hold because you let them." Talia said, "I logged the last compile and set the seals." Eleanor stood in the doorway and said, "The board accepts your sacrifice." Victoria said, "It is not sacrifice if the company walks away breathing." Ava said, "The cameras can wait." Victoria said, "Let them learn that endings can be clean." They wrapped a portrait that had watched every storm. The city leaned against the glass like a future testing the frame and finding it sound. Evening rinsed the streets in copper, as the building released her like a breath it had held too long. Arthur said, "You kept the bones, others would have sold the marrow." Victoria said, "The crown was a loan, and the interest came due." Ava said, "If you call, we answer." Marcus said, "The lattice will keep singing." Daniel said, "There is honor in a ledger that balances." Eleanor said, "History will know you chose the fire escape, not the throne." A final alert chimed that Gideon faced inquiry, and Julian lost his sponsor Halo. Victoria said, "Let the record keep its promises." She dropped the badge in a tray that shone like a small mirror. The doors sighed shut and left her in the wind. The city swallowed her footfalls as if filing them underpaid in full.